Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the Logic semi-annual meeting. We'll be doing a report out of our progress to date and our path forward going into the next fiscal year. My name is Dan Meidenbauer, and I'll be the project manager for the consortium, and looking forward into showing all of you how far we've come so far. Go ahead and click the next slide, please. So the agenda for today, I'll be doing an introduction. We'll also be getting a consortium update from the consortium director, Kristen Jabarek, and then moving on to a technical update, which will include the technical update from Anna Shin, our lead SE, and a standards update from Catherine Morse. We'll be going over some of the modeling activities that are currently happening, and then we'll have specific focus area updates of all the work that's been done at the working group meetings we've been working since January. We'll also look ahead into the next year, looking at the schedule and the activities to come. And if anybody has any questions, please leverage the Slido poll as well as the Slido the Q&A features. Yeah, let's go to the next slide. So an introduction for any of the folks that might be new on here. We in Logic are focused on the interoperability of systems via consensus-driven technical standards and the creation of operating guidelines in specific technical areas for lunar infrastructure. We've been focusing on the three areas of power, communications, and PNT this first 9-month sprint, and looking more broadly into mobility, in situ resource utilization, robotics, and constructions, and then approaching market analysis. The idea here is it's an opportunity space. It's a place where we can come together and different stakeholders, industry, government, academia, international partners can work together to identify critical interfaces between systems and then recommend interoperability standards for those interfaces. We've come a long way since January. We've been refining our processes, setting up an operational tempo, and then getting into some of the more detailed use case development and standards identification processes. Let's go ahead and go to the next slide. So as I said, I'm Dan Meidenbauer. I'm the project manager for this task. My deputy is Laura Cosentino, who also serves as the project manager for Lunar Surface Innovation Initiative here and LSIC, which many people might be familiar with already. Our lead systems engineer is Anna Shin, who's got a wealth of experience over the last 20 years in the space industry. And our consortium director is Kristen Jabarek. You'll hear from both of them today, looking at the cross-section of work we've been doing within Logic. Let's go ahead and go to the next slide. So just reminding folks how Logic really works. We are currently at one of our twice-a-year consortium-wide gatherings here, looking at the first out brief we have had for Logic. This is our first opportunity to show the progress we've made. We're doing these twice a year now, and with the goal of taking a breath to look at what we've done, identify some opportunities to have guest speakers speak, and facilitate some of the additional partnership with LSIC. The nuts and bolts of what Logic really is these working group meetings, which all of you have probably participated in, where we put pen to paper and look at specific use case development, standards identification, in power, comms, PNT, and soon ISRU, which will be kicking off in the first quarter of FY25. We also have had numerous ad hoc subgroup meetings looking at specific use cases and specific topics of importance to individual working groups, and provide a myriad of different communications portals and interfaces to participate in Logic between meetings. We have a Slack. It's very active. Please use the Slack as a primary resource. Email, the logic@JHU APL email as a means to get a hold of the team, and seeing all the products we're developing through the logic.jhuapl.edu website. Next slide. So some quick highlights. Logic has really come a long way. We are a primary interface now, a primary forum for discussion on the topic of lunar infrastructure and interoperability standards. We've developed and vetted over 28 use cases now for lunar infrastructure interoperability across 3 working groups, and even have an initial set for one of our future working groups in robotics. We've been serving as a primary interface for use cases developed as part of Luna 10 to make their way through standards identification. And we're participating in some of the other consortium and other larger scale meetings, both at LSIC in the spring. We'll be participating in LSIC in the fall, and providing presentations and partnership at conferences like Ascend. The goal here is we're going to expand, do more each month, and go further. And one of the key things to hear is that the work of all of you is the reason this has been going so well. So please keep up the great work. And with that, I'll turn it over to Kristen. Thanks, Kristen.
Yes, hello. My name is Kristen Jaburek, and I'm your consortium director. I am so glad to be here, and I first wanted to go over some of our consortium metrics. So in January, we were a group of 0, and now we have 932 members. So thank you so much for becoming members. If you are not already a member and you're on this call, I really encourage you to sign up. It is the best way to get information about what is going on. And if someone could drop the sign up link in the chat, I would appreciate that. We are focused on a commercial lunar economy. And so you'll see in our membership that industry makes up the biggest proportion of our consortium. So I think that's great and makes sense. We have our members from 43 nations. We have held 13 working group sessions, so that includes our regular monthly meeting as well as any ad hoc meetings. We have completed 28 use cases, and 158 or more standards and standards organizations have been identified by our members. So I wanted to thank you for joining. I hope that we will continue to grow. Share our information with your friends and colleagues who might be interested or who you think could make a good contribution to our group. So let's advance to the next slide. I wanted to take a few minutes to go over our collaboration tools and how to use them. So first of all, we do have our website. And on our website, there are several interesting places where you can look for information. So our outputs are documented on our website, and we'll drop the link to those outputs in the chat. You can find updated on a monthly basis, a summary of our work. You can find the use cases, the recommended standards, and you can also fill out any surveys that we have available if you want to identify some standards that you knew about to this group, if you want to identify pain points, like there's a survey section, please go ahead and submit your information. We check on that on a twice a month basis, and we take those inputs and use those in our meetings. So we really do appreciate your input and know that it doesn't go into a void. We do actually use it and look at it. For our next collaboration tool, we also have Slack. There is a Logic Slack space. To get access, please send an email to our Logic email inbox, and I or someone else on our team will add you to the Logic Slack. This is where we share a lot of our working documents and where our focus area leads and working groups will communicate information off cycle from the main meetings. So I encourage you to use Slack. I would really appreciate it. Meetings. So just in summary, we have our monthly meetings, we have our ad hoc meetings, and we have our semi-annual meetings. So this is a semi-annual meeting. The remainder of our meetings are really working sessions. And so during those working sessions, that's when we get the majority of the work done. But if you would like to volunteer outside of those working sessions, there's always homework assignments that can be done or additional contributions that can be made. So reach out to your working group lead or to our email box, and we can help get you set up with any additional volunteer activities that you'd like to do. So next slide, please. Lessons learned and improvements. So regarding our collaboration tools, at the beginning of the year, we used Miro as a collaboration tool. Miro is good and bad. People have a love-hate relationship with Miro. There's not much in between. It's really good at gathering a lot of input, but some of our members did have some technical challenges with using that tool. We are not going to be using it going forward. So if Miro made you dizzy while you were using it, don't worry, you won't have to experience it again in Logic as far as our plans are at this time. We have the website as our one-stop shop. We did do a quick refresh of our website to improve its navigation. We think it's a bit better now. Let us know in our surveys if it's enough or if there's any other information that you would like to see on our website. Like I mentioned in the previous slide, we are using Slack for our off-cycle collaboration. It is a work in progress. We only have about 100 of our 900 members in Slack, so please go ahead and join. If you feel that it's working great, let us know what you like about it so we can keep doing more of that. If there's a reason why you're not using Slack, let us know the reason. And if you have a suggestion for another tool, let us know. There's a lot of tools and a lot of working styles spread out amongst our membership. I think we try to do the best we can to include as many people as possible with our tools. So for our ad hoc meetings, we've had good attendance and they've been effective at getting work done. So we hope to continue those ad hoc meetings, and we hope that you will join us. Let's see. In the fall, if you want to see us in person, you can join us at the ALSIC fall meeting. It is in early November in Las Vegas, Nevada. We will be there, and there are a couple of sessions during that meeting that I think will be interesting to this group. And finally, we will have additional surveys for feedback on consortium operations. And I wanted to point out that right now during this meeting, we are running some Slido polls. I have dropped the poll information in the chat. So go ahead and fill that out while you're participating in this meeting. And the polls will remain open after the meeting for a few days for you to complete any surveys that you weren't able to do during this call. Next slide, please. Community leads update. So I want to give a heartfelt apology to this community. I know that we sent out a request for applicants for volunteer leads for the Power P&T and communication groups, and we have not selected leads. I think that we asked too soon. We realized, as we were conducting these meetings, that we were not ready, and I apologize for that. We are going to be working on it as the next fiscal year begins. So I wanted at this time to tell the community that we will be reopening the applications through the end of October. So if you did not apply back in the day and you would like to apply now, please go ahead and send us an email to our Logic email box. I will also be reaching out to everyone who applied previously to make sure that you are still interested. If you are not, that is absolutely okay. Life changes in 6 months, no worries. But I'll be reaching out to each of you just to check on that. Let's see, we also are seeking volunteers to work on use cases outside of the meetings. We appreciate those who have, and it really helps us to be more efficient during the meetings when we have a good solid starting place to review as opposed to starting from scratch. So again, email us at Logic if you'd like to work on use cases, or you can use the Slack as well. And finally, let's see. We are opening up the ISRU and robotics construction volunteer leads in addition to P&T, power, and communications. So again, send us your resume and your interests to our Logic email. We'll be working on that as the new fiscal year starts. And finally, we will take any input or through any of our communication channels, email, Slack, website surveys. So use those to get involved in our consortium, and the more you volunteer information, that the more that we can do together to achieve the goals of our consortium. So next slide, please. Upcoming meetings, come see us in person. We will be at the ALSIC fall meeting in early November in Las Vegas, Nevada. There's a couple of sessions that will be of interest specifically to this group, one on interoperability and logic. This isn't your opportunity to meet us. We will have some swag for you so that you can proudly promote Logic and share it with all of your friends. Registration is now open, so go ahead and get registered on that website. I do believe it is a hybrid meeting, so if you're not able to travel, there will be a component of it that is virtual as well. Our next working group meeting will be on October 15th. And since we have the ALSIC meeting in November, we will not be holding a working group meeting in November. And finally, our first ISRU working group meeting will kick off in December of this year. So we look forward to that. Next slide. I am now going to hand this over to Anna Shin for our technical update. Please go ahead and fill out those Slido polls too. Thanks.
Hey, hello everyone. Thank you, Kristen and Dan, for going over sort of high-level logistics of Logic. Now, you all are probably more interested in knowing about what exactly are our outputs, what are our end goals, what do we do with these working groups. So next slide, please. So we defined an end goal to develop standards recommendations for lunar operations and missions with input from both commercial and government stakeholders. Someday in the near future, we hope to release standards recommendations reports detailing the outcome of our work. Here's just like a nominal cover page for what we think what that might look like. It was also important earlier on to define a repeatable and consistent process across our teams to get to this end goal of coming up with standards recommendations for interoperability. So we spent some time earlier this year defining our workflows. And this image here on the right is something you may have all seen during our past meetings. Next slide, please. All right. So we often get asked, like, what is the scope of logic? So in this vastness of space, we are only focusing on lunar surface and cislunar space activities. And then within that, there are focus areas covering the fundamental infrastructures needed to expand our footprint on the moon. So we've defined those focus areas and they are in alignment with our working groups. And then further defining our scope within these areas, we are focusing on the interoperability piece. So again, Logic's goal is to develop community-driven recommendations for norms, guidelines, and standards that will enable lunar interoperability. Next slide. So when we first defined our end goal, and then we had to figure out how to get there. And so we started by asking you all, the community, 2 questions. So the first one was, what existing standards are relevant to our scope? And our first data call was to collect those standards, and here are some of the metrics that we have collected to date. And then secondly, we asked, well, what do you all plan to do on the moon? And in our subsequent working groups, go ahead, Amanda, sorry, click that. In our subsequent working groups, we collected several use cases. And here are some of the metrics for those use cases. And later on, you will hear in more detail the status of those analysis from our different working group members. You will get way more detail than probably asked for, but I think it's important to share that across the different working groups because right now, Comms, Power, and T have been meeting separately. So this is kind of like a good outbrief to you all about what each of those working groups have been up to. And then on our website, which we do update periodically, that shows the progress of our work and the outputs from analysis for each one of those use cases. But we still have a good ways to go. The next slide, please. And so how do we successfully meet our end goal? Again, we're trying to develop standards recommendations for interoperability for those focus areas. We need you. We need heavy reliance on consortium participation. And really inputs from all of you participating in the working group meetings, as well as your expertise in drafting baseline for those use case narratives prior to each working group meeting so that discussions don't start from a blank sheet of paper. And then we also need post-meeting support and analysis to rehash some of the discussions and further mature those use cases all the way through interoperability requirements derivation to standards mapping. If you think about the scale of an individual standards, hundreds and hundreds of pages with multiple line item requirements. And later on, you'll hear some work from Jason about how we plan to assist in that mapping. But our primary plan is to rely on the expertise of the consortium members' domain expertise. And so we will successfully meet our end goal through communication as well. That means us, the core team, communicating to you all what our processes are and the progress of our work. And now next slide, I'm going to be introducing the logic engineering team, who will then brief you on the more details about what exactly are we doing in the working groups and how are we going to achieve our goals. Very quickly, you'll get to meet them all here. But Catherine brings years of experience in standards development through her work in modeling and simulation, and she's going to be presenting a more standards-focused update on logic. Jason, his specialty is on model-based systems engineering, and he'll present to you how we are leveraging MBSE tools on logic. Andrew leads the power focus area with Christina supporting as subject matter expert. Both have expertise in space power systems. Bob leads our comms focus area, and within APL, he leads our RF engineering group. And then Danielle leads the PNT focus area and brought her expertise from leading the LSIC cross-cutting capabilities group. So she will probably a familiar face in this whole world that we are in. And then from the remainder of the meeting, again, you'll get more details about what we've been up to since January. All right, next slide.
All right, thank you, Anna. I'm Dr. Catherine Morse, and as Anna has said, I will be providing a brief update on standards. Next slide, please. So, and I know some of you have seen this before, but one of the primary things we're doing with Logic is we're developing standards recommendations. And so this is our process for arriving at those recommendations. So we start with user stories. These are really simple statements that take the format of, as a user, I want to perform some action to accomplish some goal. And from those, we can derive detailed use cases in the form of text-based narratives and UML diagrams, such as sequence diagrams and activity diagrams. So this is, this is engineering, so we need to do successive decomposition. And so with those use cases represented, as narratives, UML diagrams, we can identify the interfaces between the systems in the use cases. So I'm particularly a fan of activity diagrams because the transitions between the actors in the sequence diagrams are exactly the places where there are interfaces. So what we do from those is we identify the interfaces between the systems. And from those, by looking at those transitions, those interfaces, we can figure out what our specific requirements are. And that's where we're going. We're looking at those specific requirements and then saying, okay, so we've had these calls for standards that might be relevant. And so then we're going and saying, okay, is there an existing standard that completely or mostly meets these requirements? So if there's one that completely meets those requirements, fabulous. If there's one that's close, then we're probably looking at doing some sort of adaptation. So the fifth step is if we get a standard that meets all our requirements, adopt that. If we find one that's close but not quite, then we need to adapt that requirement, that standard, and I'm going to talk about that in a subsequent slide. And failing all else, we might need to recommend authoring. So this is how we're going through this process to identify standards requirements and the existing standards that meet them. Next slide, please. So I said this on the last slide: adopt, adapt, author, right? So as I said, adopt if we get a standard that meets all our requirements. Now, if we get close and we need to adapt, then that means that we'll make a recommendation to do the adaptation. But that means that someone needs to work with the existing standard developing organization that owns that standard, and specifically their working group if they develop multiple standards, and update that standard to address the unmet requirements. And I'm going over this again. I know many of you have seen it before because it's going to be important on the next slide. Now, the author option is the least favorable just because it's the most expensive and time consuming. So starting from scratch, not only is there all the work of developing the standard, but you have to start by identifying the most appropriate SDO for the new standard, and then potentially working through their process to start a new working group within the SDO if one doesn't already exist. And that's a lengthy process, and it's an expensive one. All right, so the question is, why do SDOs matter so much to Logic? Well, it's because if we recommend using standards, we need to be certain that they're stable and robust, right? And this is even a more critical need than it is terrestrially, because the cost of a standard changing out from under us is higher. It has higher impact. So if logic recommends adopting a standard, we need some assurance that it won't change without, you know, the members of the logic consortium having the opportunity to comment and be heard. So that's one of the key things about SDOs. They have requirements that they have to have due process, and there has to be time for people to comment and be heard. And so that's very important, because if we adopt something and it suddenly shifts, are there going to be products to support it? How does that could have a serious impact. So that's what matters if we're adopting. If we recommend adapting a standard, then we need to know, okay, in order to adapt it, we need to know clear processes for doing that adaptation, and all recognized SDOs have those processes. And we need to be able to gain membership to advocate for the adaptations that meet our requirements. This is also critical to SDOs. You have to be able to, people with a vested interest need to be able to get membership. So that's critical from the perspective of building a stable and robust infrastructure that does not have to change rapidly based on changing specifications. Next slide, please. So we've, as you know, we've done calls for standards, and you can see those on the website. So here are the currently identified SDOs and the number of identified standards. Pretty sure nobody wanted me to put all of the list of standards here and walk through all of them, because we would just be here all day. But you can see there's some really obvious ones here: AIAA, ISO, SAE International, the IEC, the IEEE, the Internet Engineering Task Force, but also the American Society for Testing and Materials, CCSDS, CISO, which does simulation standards, and the Functional Mockup Interface, which is actually part of the Modelica portfolio. So those are the SDOs we've identified. Next slide, please. But there are also some related organizations, which I'm sure that a whole bunch of folks here today are members of and participate in. So CONFERS is a standards recommending organization similar to Logic, whereas LSIC is a standards adopting organization. Somebody else pointed out to us an organization, a consortium called the Interoperability Plenary. That consortium produced technical resolutions, recommendations, and reports. They appear to have been inactive since June 2023. If I am not correct on that point, please let me know, but I can't find any evidence of activity since then. There are several organizations that develop specifications but don't meet the definition of an SDO. So that was what I was talking about on the last slide. Do they have clear processes for creating new standards and adapting existing ones? Is membership open? So there are just a handful of those on our list. NASA, the Moon to Mars Interoperability Working Group, which is responsible for the IDSIS specifications. The next one, we suspect we're going to get something about them soon. The 3GPP, the Third Generation Partnership Project, we've got them identified as an organization. No one has yet identified a particular specification from them. But if you have one to add, please let us know, and we'll get it on the list. And then this last one, kind of interesting, an Australasian Institute of Mining and Metallurgy, the JORC. So that's what's on our list of organizations to date. But of course, the list of organizations and the list of standards and specifications is ever evolving. And of course, once we get to requirements from our use cases, we're going to be doing some more active investigation to find out if there are existing standards to meet those which we've not yet identified. Next slide, please. Okay. So one of the things we're approaching now is collaboration with SDOs. So reaching out to the SDOs that we've identified. And it's really important that we deliver the message that we're not reinventing the standards wheel. So nobody is suggesting that Logic should become an SDO or establish its own SDO. Our goal here is to reach out to SDOs that produce the standards we've already identified as potentially applicable to make them aware of our interest. So I understand it's a webinar, so you can't ask questions outright, but please, if you have questions, will you put them in the Q&A? And I don't see any immediately, but I will be keeping an eye on this for the rest of this meeting and answering questions if they pop up asynchronously. Thank you very much.
Hi, I'm Jason Arcido, and I'm just going to pull back the curtain to show you some of the tools that we use to support the process that Catherine described previously. Next slide, please. We use model-based systems engineering, specifically SysML diagrams, to kind of describe our interactions and kind of collect all of the community input in a visual manner. We'll sort of give you demonstrations, examples of these diagrams as we go along, but it's meant to facilitate our conversation and sort of help identify gaps in our thought process as to where the interactions are or interoperable capabilities, because sometimes our narratives and perspectives are limited to those that use it and not the commercial providers themselves. But we do want to focus on the ability to intake all perspectives, trying to identify commonalities, and sort of be more efficient and reduce any overlap and redundancy so that we can have a larger conversation of the operating system on the moon. Next slide, please. Here's an example, specifically a block definition diagram. It breaks down each component of the service in a narrative that we have identified, and it gives us the capability to sort of map any identified standards to where they would be applicable. Next slide, please. Here's a quick example of activity diagram. You'll see probably a higher fidelity diagram further along in the focus areas, but this demonstrates the paths of interaction between each of the components of a system and the narratives, and sort of gives us a end-to-end understanding of where interactions occur. Next slide, please. This is a sequence diagram that demonstrates sort of all of the actors or assets that are involved in a narrative and all the transactions and specific exchanges that are in between each component. And this gives us the ability to say, here's a standard for either format on exchange or ways of communicating and passing along information. Next slide, please. Along with the use of SysML diagram, we are exploring the usage of large language models to help with the process of mapping the large amount of standards that are out in the wild to possibly identify how they could be adapted from either terrestrial to lunar applications. This is also meant to be supplemental to our process. We still need subject matter expertise to verify if the LLMs bring back proper and correct information. But this does provide sort of a entry point for the community themselves to try these tools to identify either how their workflows fit into some of the narratives that they're seeing in our working groups, and possibly look at the metadata of standards out in the wild that can possibly be analyzed by our group. Next slide, please. And now we're going to see from our focus areas how this is done.
Thanks, Jason. So now we're going to go ahead and talk about the Power Working Group. Okay, next slide. All right, so in general, what you can see here is a fantastic graphic that you'll see in the subsequent presentations as well. listing essentially the sources and sinks of our applications here, right? So for power, our core there is the power source provider, the grid, right? From that extends to different applications as habitats, rovers, and going into that is the power sources. And that's kind of highlighted on the right side there in that little call out there of the different major power sources that we've identified that we're going to basically be focusing on through these standards there. And then of course we got some orbital assets and some comms, of course. So we'll go ahead to the next slide. So here's a table of the accepted use cases. As you can see here, we currently have 10 use cases. And we're going to be talking about 1 through 3, actually 4, 2. And then you can see there, we've gone through 1 and 2. 3 is in progress, along with 4 we just touched on. And so that's slated then to continue on in October. But we'll go ahead and break them down as we go to the next comments here, the next slides. A little more on the process evolution. As was mentioned earlier there, we began with using Miro, right? Which is a nice open idea platform, right? It gives a lot of flexibility in terms of adding ideas, populating them, but they can get a little bit convoluted, right? When there's a lot of folks in there adding ideas there. Still, having that ability to have a good platform to interject ideas and to brainstorm is crucial. So throughout our ad hoc meetings that we've been having with the Power Working Group there, begin utilizing just simple PowerPoint flow diagrams. As you see there at the bottom there, it gives a good visualization of all the actors and how they interplay and how those transactions are occurring there. And that kind of spurs the innovation that those ideas, so we can get them down on paper, get them into the narrative, and then go ahead and start breaking them down into the standards. Okay, next slide. All right, so a little more on each use case here. So the use case 1, right? So this was the initial one that we really tackled here. And as a power provider, I need to provide and prioritize power requests from multiple users, right? So that's the keyword, multiple users. It's challenging too, right? When you have a lot of different users trying to absorb either a limited amount of power or at least at the different times, different loads, it can be very stressing, right? So this was tackled into the June working group there, okay? And that progressed into the interoperability considerations for the power request, load balancing, and how that all ties into the grid. We started to touch on, and you'll see in the next use cases, that the communication protocol, not between the people in the working group, but how to actually transmit information along with the power, right? Whether that's the same or different lines. How is that going to be handled? And ultimately, what are those protocols? And we'll hear more about that as we go, because it's a big one there. And then as you can see there, we have a nice output we have on use case 1 there. This is that activity diagram that Jason was mentioning there. A nice model to kind of give those transactions home, right? And from that, you can pinpoint between each of those transactions, between those bubbles in there, any associated standards that are currently existing, right? And so that's basically where we're at now. We're trying to allocate those different standards to those different transactions, break them down to the subsections, and then ultimately find the gaps that are in those transactions to start looking at those recommendations. Next slide. Use case 2. Use case 2 just followed along. Instead of multiple users, now we're tackling multiple power sources, okay? And as you can imagine, that's handling those different power sources can be challenging. And so we talked about that, had a very active participation in July. It was a fantastic meeting there, right? Ultimately, then we continue to use those different block diagrams to figure out how the interoperability, the different players interacted there. And we expanded more on the communication protocols, because we started to determine also is like, how are you going to tell the users we're about to switch power sources, or if there's any interruption or et cetera, that we need to make sure that's in there. Go to the next slide. You can kind of see the output from that. So we have both different types of diagrams listed here. And as you say there, we're at that point now where we're associating the standards with those different transactions so that we can break them down. So it's really good information that's come out of this, out of that working group. Next one. And use case three, now we get into the stressing events, the overstress protection, and really focusing on the telemetry that's associated or needed between end users, providers, sources of power, et cetera. So that way we can understand and truncate some of those maybe damaging events, right? So again, this is on the development phase right now of the model. We have all the information that we got from the meetings there, and we're incorporating that into a model generation, and that'll be upcoming as we go to the next month. All right, next slide. Use case 4. Now, use case 4 is an interesting one. As you see, there's already a model associated with that on the right there, but there needs to be some refinement associated with that. Use case 4 was talking about charging a rover, right? And so this was one of the early stages, the early on use cases that was addressed. Quickly it was found that the community wanted to backtrack a little bit, and instead of being very specific on the application, they're backtracking to the larger grid aspect, right? And that's why we did use case 1 and 2, going to 3, and now we're going to get more fidelity and tighter interaction with that application, such as rovers, et cetera. So this was touched on in the October meeting, or I'm sorry, it was touched on in the August meeting there, but again, not a lot of time to address it and clarify what had been talked about before. So this is going to be boarded for the October meeting there, and again, continue to refine this model, which is a good starting point. Next slide. Summary slide there. So some good lessons to date, right? So these are some, you can read through them. I'll just give you a quick highlight there. There is a lot of interest in this, right? A lot of interest in between industry, government. Everyone is very interested in the power standards there, which is fantastic there. Having that ability to accept those ideas in various forms of fashion is important there, right? With these meetings, you can't have 30 people talking at one time. So having that non-vocal inputs is very important there. Without Miro, Zoom chat, et cetera, is going to be playing a vital role. A lot of times we may not be able to get to all of the comments within that, but we do incorporate them for the next meeting and the outputs for the review. So feel free to keep those comments coming, especially in the chat. There is the community is cautiously conflicted between AC and DC power. What is necessary at the end user level? Okay, and so there's some good viewpoints that we're trying to capture and understand. We're addressing both, right? We're addressing both types. But in the end, what is required for the end user? And that came out actually of use case 2, when we were talking about multiple power sources and what would be the best voltage that suited the end user, and then also considering AC, what are the best frequencies for the end user there. Okay. Many terrestrial standards are applicable to our use cases so far. We're starting to break those down, as you said there, which is fantastic there. But again, and as it's slated in the upcoming comment down there too, the communication in that power grid and the network from generator to end user, there's some evolution that needs to occur there, some discussion that says how the best way to do that. And so that's going to come into interplay with our comms focus area there, upcoming in October there. We're going to have some joint meetings to discuss this and figure out exactly where that overlap is, because each of these user cases so far has required various communication protocols that we're still sorting out there. Okay. Let's see. The other things, October meeting, we'll focus on use cases 3 and 4 to kind of close them out. And then there's a little bit of push here we're going to try to do in October, right? And we're going to try to tackle 5 and 6, and that may be ambitious, but we're going to give it the good try and see what we can get. And so far, I think that's the summary we have. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Andrew. Next slide, please. I want to also thank Danielle Mortensen, our Logic PNT lead, for generating this OV1. As comms and PNT share a lot of the same assets and actors, I think this is a very appropriate way to look at it. You see all the usual suspects there between surface and orbiting assets and relays, both on the on and around the moon and on and around Earth. Next slide, please. So we had 4 accepted use cases that we began with, 2 of which we've talked about in our working groups. In June and July, we looked at use case 1. We'll talk about that in subsequent slides, as well as use case 3. We've got a couple that we haven't started yet. That's all work to go. Next slide, please. And there's also 4 draft user stories in review for acceptance. We hope to get to those fairly soon. We also have a number of additional draft user stories that were submitted, and all of these 4 shown here we discussed briefly in one working group to better understand the context and intent. Next slide, please. All right, one of the things that we learned that there is being our first use case, there was a lot of questions and learning. Early on, we needed to get us all on the same pages for the scope of logic and how we intend to recommend standards and what that process looks like. We also spend a lot of time in the first working group discussing the potential range of the problem and or user's story. And one of the things that we decided was that we needed a number of assumptions that are shown here just to bound the problem. And also we learned that it's easier to propose the assumptions up front at the beginning of the working group meeting and solicit comments or corrections rather than opening it up for a broad solicitation of assumptions. So one of our lessons learned in the process of going through this, and I think that will help to speed the use cases processing in future working group meetings. Won't go through all of the assumptions here, but you can see that there are a number that are just needed to bound the problem. For instance, the user story started with a large data volume. Well, it matters how large of a data volume we're talking about, depending on the expected data rates and things like that. How long would we expect this comms link to take, that sort of thing. So all of those assumptions have been vetted with the working group, and this use case is now out for comments, and hoping to get some comments. To date, we have none, but we do expect that there's a large number of standards that we can adopt based on deep space and near Earth missions that have evolved the standards to date, as will be the case in the next user story that we discuss. So again, looking forward to seeing comments on this use case, and there is an activity diagram generated, and we will be posting that soon for this user story use case. Next slide, please. Use case 3 was our next one that we talked about in our comms working group. This was about there's a lunar asset that wants to declare an emergency and get higher prioritization of the comms network. So this one being a little bit more specific, didn't need as many proposed assumptions, but nonetheless, we made some, we vetted those. We made good progress in that meeting. One of the recurring themes with there are some specifications out there already that are relevant to this type of activity, namely LunaNet and LunaSAR. And another thing that we discussed was that something like this use case is expected to evolve as the network evolves, the number of assets and actors evolves. But we still think that there's still going to be a large body of existing standards that we can adopt from a number of deep space and near Earth missions. Next slide, please. So that brings me to my summary. Again, encourage comments on the 2 use cases that we've talked about. We'll begin mapping those to standards and start working on our next use cases. The challenges that we had, we started slowly just so we got everyone on the same page and we encouraged feedback. Another natural challenge is that we just need to balance our desire to hear from everyone in the working group and yet still focus on the use case at hand. And with our first use case out for comments, I think once we get one of those under our belt, we'll expect a higher rate of use cases. And we'll continue to adjust and learn as we go, and appreciate all the support that we're getting from the working group. Thank you. And now over to Danielle Mortensen.
Hey everyone. Thank you, Bob. So I'm happy to present our updates from the PNT working group. Next slide, please. Thank you. So we put together this graphic. This is all the actors for our PNT side of the house. So as you can see, I'm sure if you work in PNT, there's somewhere in here where you feel like you can relate and fit into this, but we've got everywhere from orbital assets to surface beacons, surface assets, cislunar assets, everything terrestrial. And then even on our surface assets, there are different optical sensors and onboard maps and inertial measurement units that all feed into helping us understand and dictate a PNT on the lunar surface. So next slide, please. Here are all of our accepted use cases so far. So as you can see, unlike comms and power, we are not going in order, but I promise there's a method to my madness. We're starting with the simpler use cases in order to derive different narratives and standards connections there that will hopefully feed into some of the more complicated use cases. And as you'll see in next slide or so, that was something that we had gotten feedback on, was that we started a little bit tough, and so we kind of moved back into simpler grounds. But there are some notes there, and then I'm hoping that we can work with our comms group with Bob to do some search, rescue, and evacuation work in the future, hopefully soon. So next slide, please. So June 2024, we started with subsurface navigation. We only had 3 assumptions for this one so far, but some of our key takeaways was A, that this was a more complicated use case to start with. B, that mapping and reference frames were the key to understanding and bounding our problem. As Bob was saying, a lot of these assumptions and initial details help us confine the solution space of what we're talking about so that it's easier for us to not worry too much about the back and forth between technical solutions to these user stories and use cases, but just creating a good enough story to put together so that we can map to our primary directive of the standards. And then, of course, we found out there's a lot of crossover topics with communications and power. And I think that those last two key takeaways really are prevalent throughout the rest of our use cases and working groups as well. So a couple of the standards notes that I wanted to mention was that there were a lot of redundancy needs that could define the number of beacons and the number of standards that we need, depending on what kind of redundancy that we have. Back in the Apollo era, the kind of main theme was to make things as simple as possible, but have as much redundancy as possible. But the more redundancy we add, in some ways, the more complex the system, and we need standards to identify those. And then we also need standards for identifying the testing mechanisms. So making sure that we have some way of assessing the goodness of signal and the health of our assets, different power levels, all sorts of things that are involved in or that are need to knows for P&T, but maybe not necessarily P&T itself. And then the last one there, of course, that the size of lava tubes will define our power usage, relates us back to power. Yeah, so we'll come back to this use case after discussing some of the other ones, but I think this was a good learning lesson for our first go at things. Next slide, please. So our second use case that we started on was the GPS-based P&T. This was at our July working group meeting. We have a whole bunch of assumptions there that I'm not going to go through one by one, but the fact that we had a lot of assumptions, I think, made this a little bit easier. We defined our working space very well for this one. And some of the key takeaways that we found were that the assumptions were very helpful for us. Again, mapping, accuracy, reference systems, and purpose of mission all came up as primary drivers for our lunar P&T narration development. And then there was a need now for more crossover discussion, something that we found earlier, but this was, I guess, in a more vivid way, we understood that there's a lot more crossover between comms and power and some of the other future working groups even that we can benefit from and as the P&D focus group. And I also wanted to point out here that Jason created this lovely activity diagram for our PN1 use case. And it beautifully shows the different actors and their different columns, the different functions that happen, and then the interfaces between them, which is the thing that we're really after as an interoperability and interfaces consortium. So next slide, please. Yes, so just some notes on the standards that we found for this one. We were talking a lot about software standards and how important it is not to just focus on hardware and how things are physically moving about, but how we need, software to support all of this as well. And so having standards and looking into those is equally important, especially anywhere that autonomy is needed and involved. There were a couple other comments, like 2 line elements for lunar orbits, defining the lunar orbits, making architecture for scalability, so making sure that our P&T architecture can turn from, one satellite into dozens of satellites into a full-blown, GNSS type system around the moon, and other assets as well. It doesn't have to be orbital. Making sure we have accuracy requirements will definitely help us bound our problem area, and there was also a mention that there's no standards for the use of GNSS around non-terrestrial bodies. So making sure that we understand how GPS and other GNSS constellations are being used around the moon is important. and making sure that we identify those bodies, those, STOs that are in charge and are connecting with them. Lunar Standard Time was, of course, a big deal. We know that that's a White House directive at the moment. It's being developed, but there is a big call for it from the community as well. And then finally, some frequency standards, which joins us back in with communications subgroup, or focus group, rather. So we've got another modeling picture on the right there for you from Jason, showing the interconnectedness between different functionalities like determining positions and synchronizing clocks, and the different actors there as well, like the rovers, the relay orders, and GPS spacecraft. So this use case is under review at the moment. We're trying to finalize the narrative and push towards starting to connect this to standards considerations. So we might call on you. There's a post in Slack to kind of help fill in some of the blanks where we can, but everything is looking pretty wrapped up on this front. So we're excited. Next slide, please. Wonderful. Okay, so the last one that we've worked on was just last month, which was on the inertial measurement units, IMU, and onboard maps. So this was just talking about one rover asset and all of its sensors and internal maps and data and everything. And because there was only one asset with multiple working parts within it, there weren't as many assumptions that we needed to cover. So we only have 3 large level assumptions here that we needed to work with. And some of our key takeaways were that like I said, the less high level assumptions needed is probably due to the limited number of actors that were involved. We went through 4 different alternative paths, including determining where I am and where I'm going, dead reckoning, so making sure I'm trying to get there, path planning, so trying to figure out how I'm getting there, and then hazard and proximity detection and avoidance. And the key part about this was that each one of those little pieces had its own narrative, but all of them were complementary towards each other. And so it was easier to look at the story as a whole when we had the different parts defined that were able to support the definition and narrative of the other parts. Next slide, please. So just a final note on this last use case that we were looking at. Mapping, accuracy, reference systems, and purpose all came up again. We hear you. We know that that's a big deal for PNT, and I'm trying to work with some of our program management and with our standards experts and the modeling experts, and try and figure out how that can all fit in with our narratives and our use cases, and push the adapt author and I forget the last one. You know what I'm talking about. Oh, can you go back 1 slide, please? 2 slides. Thank you. So making sure that all of the standards are addressing those mapping, accuracy, reference system, and purpose needs. Another one that we were talking about is standards for computer developed maps are needed. Once again, this is something that has been showing up quite a bit, but making sure that we're considering software and mapping and accuracy is primary on our list. Thirdly, requirements shouldn't be so strict that we're artificially over-constraining ourselves. So we want to make sure that we're not pushing the requirements so far that our rover ends up in a situation where it's like, I have nowhere to go. I, can't go backwards, can't go forwards. And that's over defining what situations you can work in can be a limiting factor. So making sure we're stepping back and considering all of the different situations. And finally, our risks and requirement statements are going to be driven by balancing risk and reward in this specific case of rover assets on the moon. So I'm really excited on the progress that we made on this one, and we'll finish up those narratives during the next working group meeting, as well as starting up another one. Next slide, please. So I wanted to add in a slide here on the different challenges that we've seen from the PNT perspective, and these are more overarching across the process of what we've been doing. So one of the main challenges that I've found is that it's difficult to define our assumptions and decide on a timeline. Standards I wanted to highlight is a dynamic feature of lunar operations, and depending on whether you're talking about 2 years from now or 50 years from now, those are going to change, and the state of the lunar economy, what's available in our lunar realm, and all of the different characteristics of how the world ends up are going to push the needs for different standards depending on where we are. And building a use case for the future can be really difficult when we don't know how things are going to turn out. And this also applies to the inclusion of newer and unique technologies. Sometimes we don't really understand what technologies we're going to have, or we only have concepts available for them starting out. And so we need to try and envision and visualize how these things are going to affect us in the future. But it's important to talk about the here and now and use what we know right now to define the standards and their guidelines as we move forward with PNT. So I guess that's a call to, be patient with us as we figure out how this is working both now and in the future. And then finally, there's the separation of PNT from comms and power. Like I said, this is coming up a lot, but there's a lot of overlap, and it's difficult to draw the lines between them. So considering we are an interoperability consortium, it's important for us to work together and make sure we're not stovepiping ourselves down one area or another. And I'm excited to say that we're going to be working on that in the future for PNT and comms and maybe some power overlap as well. So next slide, please. Okay, this is my last slide. I just wanted to say that next month we're finishing up use case PN11, and we'll start on looking into the lunar ground station use case. In terms of lessons learned, we found out that more actors usually means there are more assumptions needed. So we'll try to do some more work on the forefront when there are more actors involved. We want to start with the basics, like I said, start with the simpler use cases in order to have more of a structure for some of the more complex user stories, and make sure that we're not trying to find direct technical solutions to these problems, but find the best solutions that will entice the most standards out of what we're working on. And then finally, PNT can't always be separated from the other topics, and we're working towards that. So what can you do to help? Please attend our working group meetings, join the PNT focus group on the Slack channel, and help us in filling in the blanks on our working narratives. We're always looking for more PNT standards, so if you know of any and feel inclined to send them our way, that would be lovely. I have the Logic email down there if you haven't seen it 100 times in the chat. And we look forward to working together in the future. So thank you. And I think Dan is up next.
Okay. Good afternoon again, everybody. We wanted to take also a moment to go through a little bit of the logic looking ahead, what we're going to be doing for the next fiscal year, and some of the activities that we hope to get you all to partner within. If we go to the next slide, we'll see the schedule. As you can see, we are wrapping up Q4 of FY 2024. We have come into the use case scenario development parts of both power, comms, and PNT. So we're tracking with where we really expect to be and are hoping to further articulate the robust use cases of power so that we can begin gap analysis and mapping to standards in power and then move into that same step for comms and PNT. As you can see, it's kind of a staggered sort of approach. As was discussed earlier in the meeting, we are planning to stand up our ISRU working group in Q1. And that'll sort of begin the scope and requirements definition phase, moving to the development of user stories before use case development. The intention here is that each working group will last roughly 1.5 years to deliver the initial standards recommendation report. That doesn't mean those working groups end in any way, shape, or form. It's all about getting that feedback and callback from the larger consortium, and then sort of defining that first set of standards recommendations for the community. We'll also continue to do these semi-annual outbrief meetings twice a year, and have logic opportunities as much as possible associated with the 2 LSIC meetings, both in the spring and upcoming in November in the fall. Go to the next slide. We hope to see you all at the LSIC fall meeting at UNLV. We have posted in the chat multiple times here a link to the registration for that. If that doesn't work for you, you may just simply search for it. It'll come up very quickly. If you're familiar with LSIC, it is front and center on the LSIC webpage. There will be a separate breakout session as part of the LSIC program explicitly about interoperability, with logic front and center for that, and some discussions with our compatriots in the IO working group for the deep space standards. We'll also be producing this year our first end-to-end use cases to standards models. We'll show the whole picture of, hey, here's where we got our use cases, here's those interfaces of particular relevance, and then the SysML models all the way for review for the community. With ISRU, we're hoping to get a robust element of the community, since it is so focused on the development of the commercial lunar economy. ISRU is front and center for that. Looking forward to the community really engaging on that topic. There are numerous ways to provide input, get your use cases identified, provide your feedback into logic. The working groups are incredibly interactive. I encourage everyone to participate in those. Between working group meetings, the Slack is great. If you can't use Slack, the website provides the survey portal to provide feedback on elements there. You also always have the logic email if there are questions, comments, concerns. But this community is a community. It's based on all of the input that you all provide. You all are doing the work, and the intent is this community lives a long time, and we continue to develop the robust community of standards that we're hoping to do here. Partnerships are everything. We're working with other standards development organizations as part of that adopt, adapt, author approach. And if you want to provide some of that interface to additional SDOs, come talk to us. And look out for the final report for logic for this fiscal year later this month. Should be coming out, my guess is in the middle of October. If you have any questions at all, please don't hesitate to reach out to the team. We are here to work with you all to develop this community and to really ensure that we set up the interoperability standards for the future lunar infrastructure. With that, the Slido polls will remain open. The Slido Q&A will remain open, so people who haven't had the opportunity to provide those questions, comments, and feedbacks within those communications venues on this briefing can continue to do so even after the meeting. And we will be sure to answer those questions as they come in. Thank you all so very much for your time.